Welcome all to the third session of the Political Thought Seminar sponsored by the Middle East Center at St. Antony's College, Oxford. My name is Faisal Devji, and I am convening the seminar along with my colleague at the Middle East Center and at the Oriental Institute, Usaama al-Azami. Let me introduce our two speakers for today who will be speaking on the theme of sovereignty. First, we have Neguin Yavari, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies, Central European University, and very recently Oxford Nizami Ganjavi Center Visiting Fellow, the author of two wonderful books, Advice for the Sultan, Prophetic Voices, Secular Politics and Medieval Islam, and The Future of Iran's Past, Nizam al-Mulk Remembered. She will be speaking first for 20 minutes and will be followed by Samy Ayoub, Assistant Professor of Law and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin Law School, author of the important book Law, Empire and the Sultan, Ottoman Imperial Authority and Late Hanafi Jurisprudence, whose new project is on making Islamic law relevant. And Samy will be speaking immediately following Neguin for another 20 minutes, after which we will have a discussion, and audience members are encouraged to write up their questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I will come to them when we're done with the presentations. And if they're unable to do that, they can raise their hand function and I might call on those who do so. So Neguin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Faisal, Oxford, and Usaama, for organizing this seminar. I very much look forward to your comments, everyone. My talk is going to be, it's called Islamic Imperatives and Islamic Rulers. And the focus is on the way in which we study sovereignty. We can study sovereignty in the pre-modern Islamic world. Richard Tuck's The Sleeping Sovereign criticizes Rousseau's claim that by not having sufficiently distinguished a sovereign from the government, all previous writers, this is Rousseau claiming, all previous writers have failed to understand the democratic constitution, suggesting, and Richard Tuck criticizes Rousseau to say that this must be taken with a grain of salt, for the first formulation of the distinction is not with Rousseau, but rather with Jean Bodin himself. Now, Rousseau dies in 1778, Jean Bodin in 1596. And on Tuck's claim, and by way of introduction, I wish to direct you to a passage from Ibn Khaldun's celebrated Al-Muqaddimah, where the author discusses the meaning of the caliphate. And Ibn Khaldun, of course, dies in 1406. Sovereignty, Ibn Khaldun writes, is premised on social association and necessity for mankind. It requires subjugation and force, which are signs of mankind's aggressive and animalistic nature. The commands of its possessor, the possessor of sovereignty that is, will therefore deviate from what is right and undermine the worldly interests of his subjects, for he will force upon them his own objectives and ambitions, which may surpass what they are willing to bear. The situation will differ in response to the ambitions of different generations. Compliance will be undermined as a result, and disobedience will rear its head, causing chaos and bloodshed. The distinction between a ruler and sovereignty, here between mulk and its possessor, and indeed between sovereignty and state, is central to Ibn Khaldun's discussion on the caliphate. And importantly, Ibn Khaldun is not an outlier in the annals of Islamic political thought. Sometime between April and September 1300, in a small town in Il-Khanid, Iran, the aristocrat turned Sufi master Alauddoleh al-Semnani wrote an Arabic treatise, Al-Warid al-Sharid al-Tarid Shubhat al-Marid, the inspiration refuting the rebels' sophistry, ostensibly to refute the philosophical method. In it, he wrote, the sovereignty of every sultan, and here the word he used is, the phrase Semnani used is Saltanat Kul Sultan, proceeds from his, that is God's command, hukm for command, and the justice of every king proceeds from his, i.e. God's justice. He installed them as vicegerents, Khalifa among his creatures, for the well-being of affairs in the mundane world, According to his wisdom, and by means of his wisdom, he, God, does what he, God, wishes and decides what he, God, wants. Sean Anthony has re-examined the concept of mulk in early Islamic political discourse, suggesting that it cannot merely be seen as the antithesis of an earlier caliphal ideal, a caliphate on the model of prophecy. Rather, in the discourse of the Quran and early Muslim piety, Anthony has shown mulk was a capacious term that embraces ideas such as sovereignty and dominion in both its human and divine instantiations. In this regard, the etymology of mulk resonates loudly and clearly with the etymology of sovereignty in Bodan's own usage, as studied by Tak and many others. Bodan's celebrity status in etiologies of sovereignty also rests on his taxonomical innovation. He declared that contrary to all the doctors of jurisprudence and scholars who have misunderstood the real issue, the mirum imperium of Roman law did not belong either to the prince or to the officers and agents of the state or to anybody else. It belonged rather to the impersonal state. And because it was a distinct species of power, it deserved to be called by a unique name that can only be attributed to the state. It was no longer to be called simply imperium, but rather sovereignty. And sovereignty is comprised of the power for Bodan to appoint and dismiss the officers and to give laws to everyone. Furthermore, the distinction Bodan delineates also entails a concept of perpetual sovereignty or power, thus distinguishing between the underlying location of sovereignty and the form that governmental power might take at any particular moment. But how is sovereignty conceptualized if separated from the state? Another example will illustrate the point. One telling anecdote in Siyar al-Muluk, a late 11th century mirror for princes by the famously powerful Nizam al-Mulk, vizier to two Seljuk sultans, features a wronged man for whom justice was recovered by a humble tailor in Baghdad. The tailor was well known for his unfettered access to the caliph. Having successfully intervened on the wrong man's behalf, the tailor set out to explain how his direct line to the caliph had come about. He says, "Know that I have proclaimed the hours of prayer from the minaret of this mosque for 30 years. I am a tailor by trade. I have never drunk wine, never indulged in adultery and sodomy, and never approved of improper acts. Now, in this street is the house of an Amir. One day after the afternoon prayer, I left the mosque to come back to this shop. I saw the Amir coming along in a drunken state, holding on to a young woman's veil. He was dragging her by force and she was crying for help and saying, 'Oh Muslims, rescue me. I'm not a woman of this sort. This Turk is presumptuously and forcibly carrying me off with mischievous intent. Moreover, my husband has sworn to divorce me if I'm ever away from this house at night.'" According to the tailor, bystanders did not dare to intervene, for the Turk was well placed and notorious for his cruelty. The tailor could not tolerate the impiety. He gathered a bunch of men and they marched to the commander's house. Evoking the duty of commanding right and forbidding wrong, the men yelled out, "Do you think there's no Muslim left in Baghdad? How dare you, right under the caliph's nose, drag a pious woman to your house to sin with her? Either hand this woman to us right now or we shall take our grievance to Al-Mu'tasim," the Abbasid caliph. The Turk paid no heed and ordered his men to beat up the protesters. The Muazzin come tailor returned home, but he could not sleep. He knew that it was too late to save the woman's honor, but he still had the time to prevent her from staying out all night and keep the abduction a secret from her husband. He decided to announce the call to prayer at once instead of at dawn, thinking that the debauched Turk would not realize the time and let the woman go. Caliph was awake, however, and was disturbed by the untimely call to prayers. He sent out his chamberlain to look for the perpetrator of this gross blunder who had summoned the populace to prayer well before its set time. The Muazzin was taken to the Caliph. Once informed of the Turk's conduct, the Caliph sent for the Turkic Emir and had him put in a sack and thrashed until there was not a single bone left unbroken in his body. The sack was then thrown into the Tigris. On the surface, the anecdote suggests Nizam al-Mulk, who had been removed from his position by the king a short while after penning his mirror, was disaffected with the Seljuks and therefore did not think much of Turks in general. But there's a subtle twist to the story's conclusion when the drunken trooper is brought to the caliph's court. To the impious Turk, the caliph is to have said, "What in my policy toward my subjects and toward Islam have you seen that has impelled you to perform such deeds? Have I manifested laxity in religious matters or oppression?" The moral of the anecdote is multivalent. On the one hand, it is a clarion call for the Abbasid caliph to attend to his duties and protect Muslims from the impious Turks. On the other hand, it glorifies vigilance, a staple requisite of good rulership as advised in Mirrors for Princes across the globe. But it is not the caliph that possesses vigilance. It is Islam that acts to right wrongs and deliver the common good, with the muazzin as the vessel through which Islam acts in history. Read as such, the innocuous anecdote about a humble tailor who stands up to the mighty general reflects Nizam al-Mulk's views on the political order. For it is not the Abbasids who are glorified, but Islam itself, upheld as the ideology of the state. The closing of the anecdote is instructive. There are many stories of this kind. I have related this much in order that the master of the world, the Seljuk Sultan that is, may know how caliphs and kings have always guarded the sheep from the wolves, how they have kept their officials in check, what precautions they have taken against evildoers, and how they have strengthened, upheld, and cherished Islam. In this schema, the ruler, caliphs and kings, are the arms of the state. They act or should act to protect the people and the common good. But the ruler both represents Islam and is accountable to it. The purchase of justice, which promotes the common good, is the upholding of Islam. It is clear from these and countless other examples that we just don't have time to attend to in this forum, that the study of sovereignty in Islamic history, perhaps even a conceptual history of sovereignty, suffers not so much from a lack of a consistent, traceable history, but rather the unbridgeable gap that separates pre-modern political thought from its modern counterpart, as true for political thought produced in the Islamic world as it is for scholarship on the topic undertaken in the Western Academy. For all that matters, Islamic political thought is studied in translation. On the one hand, and as generally recognized, most of the scholarship produced on global thought traces the trajectory and impact of foreign European ideas and concepts as they make their way around the world. And as regularly conceded in the Islamic world since the mid-19th century, thinkers obsessed over what was missing from their own polities and what measures should be taken to overcome the European lead in a variety of fields. Finally, political thinkers themselves engage with the canon of European political thought rather than pre-modern Islamic thinkers, even when they engage with the adverse effects of colonial modernity. Oft repeated is the lament that Islamic political thought lacks a canonical conceptual vocabulary. Other studies focus on the question of non-correspondence, or how the modern social scientific toolkit was understood or misunderstood in the Islamic world. Does the semantic field of ijtima overlap properly with society? Is dastur a proper rendition of constitution? Or can independence from foreign rule channel nation building as it was experienced in Europe when despotism was contested, and so on and so forth? In this vein, Muhammad Qasim Zaman has argued against rendering the Quranic term al-mulk as sovereignty. He observes that the idea of sovereignty has a very particular history in European political thought and that it emerged in tandem with the rise of the modern state. Whatever terms like al-hukm and al-mulk meant to medieval commentators of the Quran, they could not have meant what sovereignty meant to, say, Jean Baudin or Thomas Hobbes, he says. Zaman goes on to add that the medieval exegetes, jurists, and theologians meant a whole range of things when they wrote of God's authority and power. He was seen to be the source of everything, and by that token of political power too. This, he takes Zaman takes to attest to the lack of a connection between the currency of sovereignty and secular politics, and therefore the absence of the principle in pre-modern Islamic political life. Things changed in the modern period, we learn, as Zaman traces the evolution of God's power and authority articulated in the language of sovereignty in modern Islamist discourse, in the writings of the likes of Rashid Reda and Sayyid Qutb, who borrowed from peers familiar with Western discourse. The bulk of his article focuses on how this concept, the sovereignty of God, that is not a concept indigenous to the Islamic tradition, has come to dominate Islamist discourse in the modern period. But it may just be that we are looking for love in the wrong places. The archaeology of sovereignty anywhere in the world is very much grounded in rearticulation and rethinking. Sovereignty, in the words of David Graeber, partakes of absolute power, the power of command, the ability to issue orders backed up by the threat of punishment, and most importantly, the power to stand outside a moral or legal order, and as a consequence, be able to create new rules and to embody chaos as to impose order. Divine kingship simply represents this principle in its purest form. The monopoly of coercive force, which Weber so famously attributed to the modern state, is nothing more than its secularization. Gods had it first, and once the principle of sovereign power takes root, it appears almost impossible to get rid of. Kings can be killed, kingship abolished, but the principle of sovereignty tends to remain. It is, in fact, the organizing principle of social life, and as Baudin himself conceded, a feature of all political communities, although its precise character had never been fully understood. On 10:20 sharp, thank you.
Thank you very much, Neguin. That was really wonderfully interesting. And we will obviously come back to all these themes that you've raised, but let's move on to Samy's talk immediately. So Samy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. Okay, so I'd like to thank the organizers, Faisal Devji and Usaama, for the kind invitation, and thank you everyone who was able to make it today. So I must start with a disclaimer. In my current research, I did not set out to investigate the political authority of the Khedive of Egypt in the 19th, 20th century. Instead, the debates about political sovereignty that I'd like to discuss today were articulated in relation to Islamic courts and the colonial attempts to reform them. So from that perspective, I did not consult purely political treatises on sovereignty or others in order, or social history to glean insights into this question. Recent examples of works that's excellent in that regard are Adam Mestimian and Andrew March that might be consulted for that perspective. So my presentation today will address the contours of the political sovereignty of the Khedive in colonial Egypt, specifically in 1899, and its radical transformation in the Egyptian kingdom post-World War I in 1922. This presentation consists of two parts. The first part focuses on debates about Khedival sovereignty under Ottoman Caliphal order, and the second part will discuss the Egyptian deliberations on the meaning of the French word sovereignty or sovereignty in the post-colonial colonial Egyptian state. I observe that in some treatments of modern Egyptian legal history, concepts such as sovereignty have been taken for granted when in fact there were records of lengthy debates and discussions on its Arabic rendering and translation into the word siyada in 1922. Similarly, debates on the inner workings of the institutional demarcations between secular political power and religious bodies in the post-Ottoman Egypt indicate that these boundaries were unsettled and indeterminate even until 1930s and 40s. The ratification of the Egyptian constitution in 1923 by Egyptian nationalists after the declaration of independence in 1922 was viewed by some scholars as a legal revolution, which reversed the relationship between the sovereign and the Islamic law or the Sharia in general. Instead, in this new order, the Sultan or the king, instead of being under its rule, it became above it and be able to control the entire institutional structures that came to be in the new institutions of the Egyptian state. So this is here kind of the brief 3 points, main arguments on my presentation today. I would claim that appeals to Ottoman caliphal order enabled Muslim jurists and judges in 1899 to fend off some of the attempts by the colonial authorities to reform these courts. I would also try to point out that the limits on the sovereignty of the Khedive, although that might seem restrictive, but also allowed him some space to maneuver some of the colonial demands in how Egypt could be shaped and how the British opted to achieve in that colony. And finally, I would say that the Constitution of 1923 was by design, intentionally, was designed to be a radical shift of how the authority of the Wali al-Amr or the Khedive used to be under Ottoman rule to something completely different that they theorized and argued for very clearly in this constitution and its discussions among its members. So on May 15th, 1899, under Khedive Abbas Hilmi II, he ruled Egypt between 1892 and 1914 when he was removed from power. So a decree was issued to change the procedural design of the Islamic Supreme Court, al-Mahkama al-Ulya al-Shar'iyya, and the decree proposed changes to that would allow 2 judges from the secular appellate national courts to serve on the Islamic Supreme Court. And if that was to be successful, that would have changed the constitution of these courts. For example, these courts used to consist of 3 key components: the chief judge of Egypt, Qadi Masr, that used to be appointed by the Ottoman officials, and 3 judges appointed by the Khedive decree. And suddenly we have these 2 judges appointed by the Khedive from the appellate national courts. So that was purely a British move in which colonial officials, aided by secular illegal elite, in order to penetrate this highest Islamic judicial body, which triggered a strong response and really did not go ahead as a move. So after 20 days only, on June 3rd, 1899, a new decree was issued to withdraw this new proposed law and the entire changes that came with it. And there were 3 key figures at the center of pushing these changes. I think you can see some images of these figures on the screen here. So the first was Malcolm McLeod. He died in 1941. He was the British judicial advisor at the Ministry of Justice. Second, somebody by the name Ibrahim Fuad Pasha was appointed as the Minister of Justice in 1891. And finally, Boutros Ghali Pasha, you can see him here. He died was assassinated in 1910. So these figures were key to proposing, number 1, the bill that was proposed to the Majlis Shura Qawaneen. This is the Shura Council in Egypt, to allow these changes to go ahead. So the government made some changes to the bill. However, that bill was rejected a couple times in the council. The British were very frustrated by these attempts. They went anyway and were able to get a Khedive decree against the recommendation by this council. So a decree was issued by these changes. However, we find key figures that came as kind of heroes in some traditional circles to push against some of these colonial policies. The first one is the Qadi Masr, the chief judge of Egypt, Jamal al-Din Effendi. He was appointed as the Egyptian at the Qadi in Egypt in 1892, and the Mufti of Egypt and the Grand Sheikh of al-Azhar at the same time is Hassoun al-Nawawi. So both of these figures rejected the bill, and they presented a set of arguments that deemed that some of these changes, quote unquote, deemed antithesis to Islamic law, or khilaf al-shara, as they say. Okay, so that pushed these figures in the government. So Boutros Ghali Pasha, the judicial advisor, to go to the council and make arguments why these changes fall within the jurisdiction and within the sovereign authority of the Khedive. So the minister affirmed that the 2 Muslim judges from the appellate national courts would be sufficiently equipped to serve on the Islamic courts. And he elaborated that the job description of such position is, quote unquote, administrative matter that falls within the exclusive purview of the government. In other words, the minister dismissed the obvious institutional differences between Islamic and national courts at the time, as long as these differences are reduced to the Muslimness of these figures who are going to serve in the court. So the minister reminded his interlocutors that it was the government prerogative to decide the job descriptions of who was going to serve on Islamic courts or secular courts for that matter. So for me, that could be read as a rejection of the historical and the institutional practice in Egypt until up to this time, in which Sheikh al-Azhar and the Grand Judge of Egypt played key role in selecting, disciplining, and reviewing decisions by all Islamic courts until that time period. So the minister presented a set of arguments to assert the political authority of the Khedive in Egypt, which gave him the power to appoint judges in the judiciary. According to the Minister of Justice, the political sovereignty of the provisional rulers, wilayat al-umara, is a very important term here. It was general, and it included the power to establish the judiciary and appoint judges. The minister declared that there was no doubt that the Khedive in Egypt has a sovereignty, and the word he used, al-Khidiwiyya, okay? And he enjoyed a general political authority, which included authority over Islamic courts in Egypt. It followed, he maintained, that the appointment of judges is a concomitant right of the Khedive. The minister continued to argue that Alexander can explain that the judicial appointments in Egypt was delegated to local government by decree from the Ottoman Sultan. And as a result, the government exercise of the power to appoint judges across the provinces in Egypt was granted already by the Ottoman Sultan, except in Cairo, which the Sublime Porte appointed the chief judge up until the very late 19th century. So the most contentious claim in the minister's remarks in these debates inside the Shura Council was that his assertion that the sovereign power of the Khedive in Egypt was a general authority. He explained that the previous judge in Qadi Masr, the judge of Egypt, was appointed by Khedive Ismail, and no one contested this authority by the Ottoman Sultan or by local Muslim authorities in Egypt. He claims that was for 15 years, no one said anything. So in his role as a chief judge, supposedly that Qadi Masr has issued long opinions. Some of these opinions made them to the most canonical fatwa collection by the Mufti of Egypt for almost then 50 years, Muhammad al-Abbas al-Mahdi. You can see his image here on the left of the screen. And no one really has said anything in this regard. So the narrative by the minister, however, falters when we know the actual recorded historical documents that we see, in which the Ottoman opposed any type of completely independent Egyptian purview over the judiciary. We actually know for sure that the Ottomans sent an actual telegraph to the Khedive declaring and appointing the Qadi Masr into the early 20th century. So any claims by the minister that the Egyptians have, that the Khedive had that independent authority to appoint that judge, that doesn't seem to be the case. The minister also attempted to explain away Ottoman approvals of judicial appointments of the last judge, quote unquote, as a promotion in rank, not as initiating the appointment. So to summarize, the arguments of the Minister of Justice in Egypt should draw our attention to the fact that some of the political elite in Egypt attempted to diminish the Ottoman political and legal sovereignty in the Egyptian province. At the end, this was unsuccessful efforts on the part of the minister, who had played a key role in serving British colonial interests under the pretext of reform. So it's important to stress that the arguments by the Mufti and by the Judge of Egypt were not simply that this is kind of antithesis to Islamic law or somehow contradicts rules of Islamic law. They had compelling arguments and reasons beyond the general frame that the minister attempted to say. So first, they argued that the Islamic Supreme Court decisions in Egypt, according to the ordinances of the Islamic courts, is a form of legal responsa. They are the fatwa, which required legal discovery and expertise in Islamic law, as opposed to simply state codified law. Thus, those who would serve on the court must be knowledgeable scholars and judges in Islamic courts, as well as Hanafi jurisprudence, as used to be the official school of the Ottoman Empire. And then we had also raised concerns about the arguments of the Minister of Justice about the sovereignty of the Khedive. Now, we cited that the famous Al-Fatawa al-Hindiyya to affirm that if a judge was appointed by the Caliph in one of the provinces, the local emir has no authority to appoint a different judge. in this province and has no authority to resolve disputes himself among the people. If the local emir acted against the caliph directive and appointed the judge anyway in the province, his decisions, according to Fatwa al-Hindiya, are void and null. So in short, the central point in debates in this debate is the affirmation of the caliphal sovereignty over Egypt in 1899. It reveals how appeals to Ottoman caliphal authority shielded Muslim institutions and Islamic courts, at least temporarily, from colonial interventions and immediate dismantling. So it took some time. I would suggest that the current accounts that dismiss Ottoman caliphal authority as purely symbolic or rhetorical understate that its historical significance as a key obstacle to the colonial hegemony and control over some of these Muslim institutions like the Waqf and other or Islamic courts, as we just disclaimed. So this leads me to my second point about this debate about what exactly is sovereignty in Egypt. On the screen here, you can see 4 sentences to the Egyptians' internal deliberations of the meaning. They mentioned of the French word sovereignty, okay, or the English sovereignty. They said, as you can see on the screen, مصر دولة سيدة, okay, or مصر لها القدرة التامة, or مصر شريفة, or مصر دولة لها الولاية العظمى. They had no idea what exactly sovereignty could mean. Again, that was 1923. So in 1922, March 1922, the Egyptian king issued a decree to form constitution committee to put together the Egyptian constitution after independence. So that constitution was preceded, of course, by lengthy conversations and negotiations between Egypt and Britain, and key disagreements about the British military prisons and supervision of some kind of some government function kind of hanging in there, and did not really was resolved until that time period. But we have something very important. We have a direct reaction by key government official who was the Minister of Justice, to tell us his assessment of this new project in relation to all the kind of history of the Khediwiyya in Egypt. His name is Ahmed Pasha Zulfiqar, was the Minister of Justice in 1923. He wrote a memo in which he offered an assessment of the new constitutional order compared to previous institutions in the pre-World War I. The gist of the memo, in my view, can be summarized in 3 points, very quickly. Number 1, the new constitutional monarchy diminished the power of the king significantly in relation to any authority of Wali al-Amr that used to exist up to this point. Second, the new order, in his view, was superior to the previous institutions, which suffered from quote-unquote limited legislative authority of the councils and lacked political accountability for the government. Third, the new order expanded the representation of local constituencies and minorities. To this minister, to the Faqar, the most important article in 1923 Constitution is number 23. And this article declared that all sources of authorities emanate from the Ummah, from the nation. Ummah here does not mean the Muslim religious community, but here the Egyptian nation. He claims that in all previous political designs, he argued that Wali al-Amr was the only source of authority and legitimacy, where he was able to share some of his power through legislative and ministerial councils. So the conversation about constitutional making in this period is key to the political orientation of these members who served on the committee. All of them, without exception, were attempting to formulate an Egyptian equivalent specific to a specific concept of sovereignty. All the references, with no exception, mention either the French, German, English, or American forms of government for that Egypt to be able to follow and emulate. So I'd like to focus in this part very quickly on the rise of a key Arabic term, siyada, that came to be used as synonymous with sovereignty. I would suggest that although the term is taken for granted, yet its history is rather obscure. I would like to make 4 preliminary observations. First, the word siyada, as used today in Arabic vocabulary, as sovereignty, is only 100 years old. Second, the discussions of the committee of the first Egyptian constitution after independence reveal that the term is contentious and ambiguous. Third, the term siyada was invented specifically to mirror Western conceptions of sovereignty. Fourth, there were unsuccessful attempts to ground the emerging sovereign power of the Egyptian state within Islamic political and legal tradition. For example, all attempts to use the word wilaya instead of siyada were rejected. So now I'd like to share with you some of the content of these discussions inside the committee. On September 1922, the following conversation were recorded among the members of the Constitution Committee concerning the first article of the Constitution. So the first proposed phrasing of that article of expressing sovereignty of Egypt is that, as you can see here on the screen, Masr dawla sayyida hurra mustaqilla. Tawfiq Pasha protested the use of the Arabic word sayyida. He elaborated that the committee members meant to express the meaning of the French term sovereignty in Arabic. He stressed that the term sayyida in the Jurjani's Ta'rifat, is a famous Arabic source when you look up for some definitions, used to mean of the word Sayyid or Sayyida, الذي يملك تدبير السواد الأعظم, or that who can manage the affairs or govern the vast majority of people. He proposed instead that, again, in his mind, that the word Sayyida is actually going to fall short of the meaning of what sovereign mean in Western political thought. Okay, he thought Sayyida because it's only the vast majority, not everybody that's in the term is not actually deemed suitable. So he proposed instead to use the term wilaya. Okay. So Tawfiq Pasha elaborated that the article would then read as Masr dawla laha al-wilaya al-uzma ala nafsiha, or Egypt will have the authority to govern itself. So, well, somebody else stand up in the committee and proposed, that was Sheikh Bakhit al-Muti'i, the famous Egyptian mufti. Again, like Rifa'a Pasha, he did not support the use of the word Sayyid or Siyada or Sayyida. He instead proposed that the idea that Masr, as you can see here on the screen, the second sentence, Masr laha al-qudra tamma, or Egypt has the full capacity and authority. A third person rose up in the committee and said, his name is Mahmoud Abu Nasr Bey, or Bey, objected to these attempts to reveal that, guys, we have spent so much time to find the word translation Siyada for that term, sovereignty. So although the term Siyada might be unfamiliar to many people, he acknowledged, but that term will only need time to be able to be commonly used among people. So at this point, Rifa'a Pasha and other folks in the committee rejected all these claims, and they had the vote. The majority voted to use the word Siyada as the most important term that will come up in that framework. So I will just end by something very quickly here. One of the most important figures on this committee, his name is Abdulaziz Fahmi Beg, and later became a prime minister, a foreign minister, interjected to emphasize the importance of stating that sovereignty in Egypt in the constitution should become as kind of the first word in the sentence, not the last word. As you can see here, they say Misr on the second sentence, Misr dawla hurra mustaqilla, that's Siyada. He was objected to use the word Siyada at the end of the sentence. And he made a simile to this word here, to that phrase, huwa qadir qahir ilah. Okay? This is a very interesting simile and metaphor. He basically claimed Siyada, as he understood it, is the central concept through which independence and freedom can emanate. Okay, and he used here in that phrase, huwa means God, qadir, kind of omnipotent, qahir, overpowering God. He says here that this sentence in Arabic does not make sense because we must use the word ilah to be first. You're going to say ilahun qadirun qahir. It's basically he's saying we must use the word siyada. So he says Misr that siyada dawla hurra mustaqilla. And this is exactly what came to be in the constitution. So for them, their debates about sovereignty inside the committee came to mirror a particular image, a particular understanding what sovereignty might look like in the emerging Egyptian state. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Samy. Another really wonderfully rich presentation. And they actually strangely talk to each other across the centuries. So, it'll be really nice to see you and Neguin talk to one another as well. I have a question for both of you in a way, and then Usaama maybe, and we have a number of questions in the chat. Neguin, you begin with Tuck sleeping sovereign, which is very interesting because, of course, one of the things that book deals with is the latency of sovereignty, that it actually goes to sleep. It's latent and it awakes. But whether it's Baudin or perhaps even Hobbes, the sovereign power, asleep or awake, has to be manifested somewhere or embodied institutionally somewhere. And it could be the figure of the prince, or it could eventually be the figure of the people in the version that Tuck gets out of Rousseau. But what you seem to be arguing is for a certain a different kind of latency of sovereignty. Except in this case, in your case, it's actually not manifested or embodied in any specific office or group. And what I found fascinating is that it becomes really unattached. And so it can be the muezzin / tailor who embodies it in the name of Islam. Or as with Ibn Khaldun, it could be a power that has violence built into it, that could be exercised multiply. And I wonder, therefore, if you think in this period that you're dealing with and these narratives you're dealing with, whether it is possible to consider sovereignty, let's leave aside for the moment the problem of translation, almost as a kind of pure principle. It really isn't like the Hobbesian sovereign located in the prince, nor is it like a Rousseauian form of sovereignty, which is latent or belongs to a populace or an assembly. It seems to function in a kind of conceptual register, freed of any specific office. Nor does it seem, nor do your thinkers seem to want to attach it firmly to any specific office. You know, when you were talking about the caliph, the Abbasid caliph, who is actually not the, as it were, location of that sovereign power. And for Samy, again, really very interesting how, linking up in a way to what Neguin was saying, how with this conflict with the Khedive and the British advisors, how actually the Khedive comes to be the anti-sovereign in some ways. And precisely because of that, sovereignty must reappear somewhere else, even in what apparently are the most unusual of places, you know, the institutional formations that are supposedly below the office of the Khedive. And okay, they might refer to the caliphate, distant as it is, or they might refer to Sharia, or they might refer to many other things. But it just, it made me wonder whether the references either to the caliphate or to the Sharia actually serve to legitimize this sovereignty, which is no longer attached to the figure of the prince, but cannot really serve as its repository, which is perhaps why you end up with, despite the continuing theological relationship with that phrase that, you know, Qadir, etc., Qair, in the body of the people or in the state, in the nation, in the Ummah as Egyptian nation. It also struck me as interesting that Fatwa al-Hindiya as an Indianist is invoked, because if that is the same as the Fatwa Alamgiri, as it is known in India, it's normally seen as an attempt by the Mughal emperor to actually corral the religious classes and claim, if you will, a certain kind of added power, if not sovereign power, for himself. So it's used in a completely different way in this set of debates. Yes, so, and eventually, of course, as we know, sovereignty in a certain kind of Islamist thought then comes to be expelled altogether and predicated of God. So it's a kind of fascinating set of moves that are happening here, both in the kind of pre-modern situation that Neguin is dealing with, where it seems to be a matter of principle, and in your case, Samy, where the prince actually becomes an anti-sovereign and therefore something else is happening. So sorry, a bit of a shaggy dog question, but I wonder if there's anything in it for either of you. Neguin?
It is, I mean, clearly the issue here is that sovereignty is, you know, when we, if you think about my paper in light of Samy's presentation, then it actually makes a lot more sense. You know, the way in which, I mean, sovereignty is debated as if it is something like, I don't know, a degree or a charter that can be obtained or that can be replicated, whereas sovereignty, in fact, is, and I mean, sovereignty as studied precisely in the West, which they're trying to emulate, sovereignty is a concept that has a history, and it is not a function of the degree of independence of a state or whether or not it can feed its population or build roads or do any of that. And that sort of very nicely, in fact, crystallizes the debate. So where you have in Ghazali, Jowaini, and all the people that I read, I mean, it is a given. Sovereignty is almost like a narrative construct to talk about politics. And clearly, like all narrative constructs that are forged to make political thought possible, each and every one of them, anywhere in the world, I mean, from prehistoric times to the present, you've narrative, you have God. And I mean, you have a religious conception of a religious / ritualistic conception of sovereignty. Sovereignty is denoted in feathers. Sovereignty is associated with the dance. Sovereignty is represented in ritual in its earliest iterations. And so the fascinating thing, the absolutely fascinating thing about medieval Islam is precisely the way in which the impersonal state that Bodan is and all the other ones after Bodan pick up on, that impersonal state, it is represented in a triangulation. So you have neither caliph nor sultan. I mean, you're writing precisely about what's the relationship between the caliph and the sultan in the 11th century. That's when you get this debate at its best. And sovereignty belongs to neither nor. And sovereignty itself is represented in the impersonal usage of the word Islam, which in a fascinating way, of course, you find the same thing in Egypt in the Mamluk period. I think it is Joseph Rappaport at the Queen Mary University now, who has this wonderful article about the way in which the legal system in Mamluk, the changes in the legal system, in fact, sort of highlight this the very close, intricate connection between Sharia and Siyasa, or Fiqh and Siyasa, which is almost always in modern political discourse seen as rivals or pitted against one another. And it is in that triangulation you have, on the one hand, in the narrative, and which fascinates absolutely. And we have very few, we hardly dealt with this concept at all, or with the way. But the important thing is that we know it through its opposition. So that what is it that you write against? So when they're discussing sovereignty, what is it that they're writing against? And it's not, in theological discourse, they are not writing against secularity in any way or form when they write about sovereignty. Now, in modern disc, when there's this presumption of secularity with sovereignty that is really, I think, limited to the world outside Europe. And in fact, it reveals a complete misunderstanding of the archaeology of sovereignty in Europe. So in that sense, it is very, illuminating, I think it is, to look at the ways in which this notion of an impersonal Islam that is a stand-in for sovereignty for 1,000 years. You can easily show this in different writings, in different contexts, and yet you see the way in which Islam is evoked as a latent and perpetual. I mean, it takes every single box. And then, of course, in the modern period, you have it. The real challenge of it becomes the sovereignty of the people. So how does in the modern period, how does this exchange sort of get reformulated?
Thanks very much, Neguin. Samy, any comment?
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Faisal. So. In my current research, I do not really look carefully on the concept of sovereignty. So as I mentioned, in terms of how was theorized or discussed, it just emanates. So in my work, I look at the history of this institution of Islamic courts in Egypt and what type is, we have a general idea that heavily researched, everyone around Egypt wrote about the history of this courts, but it seemed that I'd like to get more details about what really happened in terms of these readjustments. For example, having Islamic courts for the first time in Egyptian history in 1870, we have a specific date, in 1897, Islamic courts were limited to only family law on that date. And I'd like to know how that happened, what type of arguments that were put in that regard, how Islamic law, Islamic courts from being state courts suddenly became quote unquote religious courts. I think we have general ideas, and I'd like to provide much more details to what exactly happened, what kind of argued. In these details, I found conversation about sovereignty, to my surprise, but I think should have been a surprise because look, Islamic judges and Islamic muftis and these Azharis at the same time, they understood that the existence of the institutions is dependent on their ability to appeal to Ottoman Caliphal order because it maintained its existence as an actual reality, okay? So the issue here is not simply the appealing to something that is ambiguous, but they understood clearly that the Ottoman Sultan had an authority, even if it was challenged, as you mentioned, by the Khedive, but to some extent, they thought that they can invoke it, and I think they invoked it very effectively at the time. What really happened is when the Ottomans lost the war, things has been completely changed. So here we have an actual military defeat that will allow certain type of arguments to be possible. That was not possible before under the Khedive, who, to be honest, especially the last one, the one that we're discussing here for the war, he actually was kind of deposed by the British foreign minister when he was living in Istanbul. So in short, yes, the conversation about sovereignty is very fascinating to see how the Khedive, and even from the Khedive Ismail, that was kind of 1870s, every single Ottoman official who wrote on that subject, and they felt very clearly that the Egyptian officials and the Egyptian Khedives who insisting on some more independence from the Ottomans are very short-sighted, that they want to be very close to Europe, want to be part of Europe. They thought that will give them more, will give more leverage to these European powers over Egypt to shape them as they want in terms of appointing ministers for the treasury, even the budget for the British army in Egypt. All of this was completely decided by the British, and Egypt has no say in this. But that's, again, that goes further when the British want to form a kind of new legal system or the new courts or form things. And the British have specific ideas what religion looked like in society, what family looked like in society. That moment is different, for example, when we look in 1922, when suddenly the Khedive is completely out of the picture, but not just that. If you look, for example, for something about the role of al-Azhar, okay? Who used to appoint Sheikh al-Azhar until the Egyptian history? That was the Khedive. That was in the purview of the Khedive. We have something called Diwan al-Awqaf. That was in the purview of the Khedive, okay? Because that was his religious representative of the Ottomans in Egypt. That was important purview. The first thing the British did was to make sure the Khedive has no money by taking this out of him and putting the Awqaf under these parliamentary councils that are actually able to form. Number one. Number two, they moved the appointment of the Sheikh al-Azhar into the hands also of the political elite. So it's a massive expansion of this secular political elite power to completely control the state, not just religious authorities, but law and Islamic law and everything within it. I see consequences for some of these things. A consequence of it is that the most Egyptian legal elite, especially secular legal elite, came to say that Islamic courts are not possible for the modern Egyptian state. Islamic law can be part of the civil law, but beyond that, there's no really need for some of these institutions.
Thanks very much, Samy. Usaama, do you have any comments, or we can move to the? I see we have 5 questions already.
There are plenty of questions, and it's a bit noisy here, so I will hopefully have the opportunity to sort of participate. Really amazing discussion so far, and I don't want to deprive the various questioners from asking their questions, and I look forward to joining in midstream.
Great. So shall I ask, shall we go back and forth, Usaama, and ask in reading out the questions?
Absolutely. I'm happy to actually go ahead and read the first one.
Go ahead.
And please forgive me, there's some noise in the background occasionally. But hopefully you can hear me, and if there's any issues, please do let me know. So the first question comes from someone by the name of Samran Ahmed, who's asking, and it's not specified who's being asked, but I suspect this may be of interest to both of you. Where does one place the concept of wilayat, or sacred domain, as employed in the context of Sufis of medieval South Asia in relation to sovereignty of the medieval sultan? Does it hold an intermediate domain between sovereignty of the sultan and God? That's the question. And I think this could be of interest to both of you. So, but Neguin, I think since we're dealing medieval, it might be in your terrain a little more.
To answer this question, I mean, I don't know Samran Ahmad either, but to answer this question, we have to disaggregate the problem. And the question of the sovereignty of the Sultan, I mean, the sovereignty of the Sultan is itself a very compromised sovereignty, even in the best of times. There is nobody who sits there and writes, "Oh yes, the Sultan, go, go, go." It's always the case. I mean, if anything, if in a sort of conventional 19th century type of conception, that sovereignty would lie with the caliph, or really with God himself. I mean, there is no such thing as sovereignty of the Sultan in Islamic political thought. So that the question of the sovereignty of God and the relationship between wilaya and the sovereignty of God, who gets to represent the sovereignty of God on earth, or how do we, the debate, the discourse will be over who gets to represent it. And I think that debate is sort of settled in the 10th century. Now, what does that exactly entail? And in practice, how does it affect it is one thing to study the wilaya of the Sultan of the Sufi in, say, not in the 9th century, whereas by the time of the Naqshbandis, of course, there is no sultan, and then I mean there's hardly God in Naqshbandi writings. I mean, the Sufi master is sovereign, and he shows that by acting out of time, out of space. He goes, he owns the entire world in his command. So I think the question needs to be rephrased in order to be properly addressed, and rephrased more in the sense of how is the sovereignty of, how is the sovereignty of the Sufi master represented in practice and in writing, and what are the connections, and that will allow us to sort of rethink that or understand the notion of wilaya. But wilaya is really the intersection of political thought with political practice. Otherwise, you're studying nothing, you're studying fluff.
So, I mean, just to clarify, and in a sense, you've rephrased the question very nicely, and it would be sort of nice to get a little more of your thoughts on that. But when you're saying wilaya is a political theory with political practice, the wilaya of the Sufi, of course, as you said, with respect to the Naqshbandis in the later period, is fascinatingly not just a spiritual wilaya, but almost, as you put it, this kind of global wilaya. They, in a sense, control the kings and the caliph and so on. So I wonder what sort of strain that puts on, notions of even caliphal sort of sovereignty. Obviously, the Sultan is kind of seen as something of an illegitimate almost in some understandings, except when it's fused maybe in the Ottoman context. But is there a conflict between the spiritual wilaya of a Naqshbandi sheikh and the caliph, for example?
Well, the Naqshbandi sheikh will not have to worry about that, because there's no caliph. I mean, the caliph is in the Tigris. The Mongols put him there, and right. The Mamluks are pretending to be caliphs, but nobody takes that very seriously. So that's. But if you want to think about it, it is what's tremendously interesting is that from the 11th century. I mean, this is what's by interesting. I mean, what's interesting to me. So let's think about it like this. Okay, I mean, others will find other things interesting. But you have to, in the 11th, the problem with clearly early modern Islam is Sufi. Now, no matter how, whether there is no such thing as Sufism, we all know there are Sufi movements, there are gazillions of Sufi movements, gazillions of Sufi conceptions, but early modern history belongs to the Sufis. Now, then the question will be you can use early modern as an interesting concept, as sort of a heuristic device, only if you understand it as taking you from one period and into another. So what does that change represent? How can that change? What is the historical process that is being manifested, that is being reflected in the emergence of Sufi orders as the owners of history in the early modern period? Now, in other words, that historical change is really a study of religious change. So that, while clearly the crystallization is in the post-Mongol period, the trends begin in the 11th century, before the Mongol period, and the way in, and it also crosses the Sunni-Shia divide completely, so that in its model of authority, in the way it uses hadith, in the way it relates to this business of Sunni-Shia really ultimately makes absolutely no difference. And of course, the interesting thing is that trend, in spite of everything that we are reading about Sunni-Shia, even in the 20th century, one of the most fascinating comparisons that you can make is between Hassan Hanafi and Ali Shariati on the notion of Tawheed. When you use Tawheed as a revolutionary concept, and in that sense, think about Samy's presentation. Okay, so to me, it's amazing. Sayyid Qutb follows the Khadib of Egypt. If there's one person beholden to the West and to the empire, it's the Khadib of Egypt, and especially that last Khadib we learn of him in our history classes as the villain of the period. But Sayyid Qutb resorts to his conception, or the conception of this secularizing parliament of Egypt, this secularizing moment in Egyptian history. That vocabulary becomes the vocabulary of Islamist political thought in the 1960s. So he doesn't use Sayyid Qutb does not go to Ibn Khaldun, he does not go to Ghazali, he does not go to Juwayni, he does not go to any of those. He goes and he uses Siyada. And in that sense, if you think about, for instance, the way Schulze distinguishes between the various, Reinhard Schulze classifies the various Islamist discourses in the modern period. So which ones use the past as myth and which ones use the past as utopia, and how that affects the agenda that the revolutionary agenda that they set. But to me, it's fascinating that, from the 11th century until the sort of the 20th century, you have you have people reading each other. And then all of a sudden in the 20th century, from Islamist to King to, secular to whoever is sitting there, is arguing whether or not our sovereignty is as good as the European one, or that we should rethink it.
Thank you very much, Neguin. I guess, Faisal, Samy, you have your hand up, and I think you have plenty to add to this conversation. So I'll just hand it over to Samy, and then Faisal, you can take it there on, if that's all right.
So just very quickly, I would be surprised if Islamists will go back to Ghazali and Juwayni, because again, the entire system that they are functioning with is not based on some of these conceptions. I would even claim something that actually come in the conversations among these committee members who founded the Egyptian Constitution in 1923. I would claim that sovereignty, or siyada, is a rejection of wilaya. Look, Abdulaziz Fahmy Bek made an argument saying, guys, Egypt can be independent and can be free, but cannot be sovereign. He says Egypt was never sovereign under the Ottomans. Egypt was not sovereign under the British. He even claims that, look, Algeria and Tunisia were described in their constitution under the French to be free and independent. So for him, sovereignty is not wilaya, clearly, okay, as he understood it. So for example, he said so he added that Egypt had no sovereignty under these ties, because sovereignty is basically is the ultimate authority beyond which there's no other power. So he argued that in Egypt, sovereignty is made of three elements: homeland, watan; second, nation, third, the ability to govern this nation within this homeland, okay, as well as the ability to legislate for them. So the absolute sovereign power diminishes, to Fahmy, any authority beyond it. So So I guess my proposal here is that when the modern conceptions of sovereignty are intentionally a rupture designed to move away from what Muslim political thought used to function. Is not so. I get a bit sometimes surprised by people think that we can have a continuation of some sort. That this is not the conversation of people who made up this new system. They reject that system for obvious reason that they state them themselves. I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Samy. So we have a couple of, one for Neguin and then another one for Samy. So the one for Neguin is Milad Odabai. I'm really trying to understand your methodological intervention. If I understand correctly, you highlight one, the limit imposed by the European canon in both the West and modernizing Islamic world, and two, the emphasis of scholars who face the limit of the canon on incommensurability and untranslatability of the Islamic past. Can you elaborate on your methodological way out of this impasse? Are you suggesting that the modern Schmittian exceptional concept of sovereignty is sufficient to translate across past and present Islam and the West? Hopefully my misunderstanding can help you further elaborate your argument.
Well, thank you, Milad Odabai, for this question. No, your misunderstanding will not help me further elaborate my argument. 2 more hours of sitting here and discussing this will, but well, obviously we can't do that. So it's very interesting. This is exactly how I used to write my own questions, and when I attended talks 20 years ago, Milad. There's no methodological impasse. All we need to do is to read the texts and read the past. I mean, this is the notion of sovereignty itself and the modern debates on sovereignty, as Samy has shown, that too has its own moment in history, which is when these lawmakers are sitting there in the 1920s and saying, we cannot use concepts from the past to write about sovereignty because sovereignty is different. Now, obviously, this is tied into the notion of a state and to the notion of Islam and the way in which Islam is seen and sort of internalized as the impediment. A, it's seen as religion. B, it's seen as an impediment to modern political life. So that, for instance, if you think about the etymology of the word sovereignty itself, that etymology is very clearly tied to kingship. And it is maintained and preserved when kingship itself is abolished. Sovereignty does not sort of get tossed into the dustbin of history when you have a republic, although it very clearly is tied to the concept of sovereign. But in the deliberations of the Egyptian parliament, if we are to take Samy on his word, then precisely, you see, because that, for instance, we don't have a caliph, we cannot talk about walaya, or because we don't want kings, we don't write about mulk, which has such a rich conceptual history in the writings in political pre-modern political discourse. So that precisely that effort, and precisely that, whether it's felicitous or not, but that effort is a part of the archaeology of sovereignty in the Islamic world. So that when you look at that, I mean, a lot of the history of the early 20th century is taken up precisely with these questions now, by critics of governments, by governments themselves, and across even divides of sovereignty as in independent states, or in the case of medieval Egypt, where of course independence is indirect at best, or sovereignty is discussed indirectly at best. Beholden as medieval Egypt is to higher notions of authority, even if as fiction. So that in other words, the history of sovereignty in the Islamic world in the 21st century or in the second half of the 20th century will have to reflect these very deliberations over what it is that how is it that sovereignty can be defined. It can be defined, but when we are studying it, Milad, we are am I suggesting that the modern Schmittian exceptional concept of sovereignty, there's nothing modern in Schmidt's articulation. I mean, Schmidt himself is the first one to concede that this idea that you stand outside of the law and you stand outside of God, I mean, that's why it's political theology. It's political theology because it sort of starts with God. That is precisely the role that God himself envisaged, that the role that is envisaged for God in the Old Testament. So what exactly is modern political thought? And and the elephant in the room or the elephant in any of these discussions is whether or not we bow to the incommensurability between political thought and political institutions on the ground. But that is not an issue that can be solved in a discussion on political thought. In other words, whether or not we have a robust nation state that corresponds to robust discussions of sovereignty, we have robust discussions of sovereignty in Islamic history precisely where there are robust crises in political representation and political authority, as in the 11th century, as in the 20th century. So that a robust discussion is not the existence or the absence of sovereignty is something that that I think will not lead to a fruitful discussion. That's what we mean by a concept that is perennial, by a principle that is found across cultures, across times. There is no such thing as a political order without a notion of sovereignty. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Neguin. Again, very, very rich sort of reflections on the part of both of you. And I wish we had a lot more time than we have, unfortunately, but we only have another 13 minutes or so. And I wanted to ask Samy the next question. I'm going to ask the question that Mahdi Askaria has asked, but I'm also going to tie in with that based on a comment you just threw in, where you, in a rather animated fashion, if I may say so, pointed out that these people were trying to create a disjunction, right? The people who are coming up with this modern notion of siyada were trying to depart from the previous tradition. So why, would modern Islamists try and jump over them and engage in? But I mean, I think the common understanding, of course, is that modern Islamists are a medieval throwback, and there are various ways in which that's, a misunderstanding. But they also very often market themselves in that way, right? I mean, they often will say that, look, we are engaging with the original sources and so on. But I suppose you'll point out in response to my question that, reaching for the original sources isn't the same as reaching for Ghazali or al-Juwayni or al-Mawardi, right? So I guess my question is that my own personal question before I get to Mahdi Askari is Junaid Qadri's recent book, which I don't know if you've had the time to read, but, he posits, in my view, rather provocatively, but in many respects rather compellingly, that there isn't sufficient continuity to really refer to this as the same tradition in the McIntyrean sense. That Assad posits this notion of Islam being a discursive tradition, and so even these modern sort of like modernist groups can be considered to be part of the Islamic tradition, but in a sense they have made a very deliberate rupture with that tradition, as you illustrate. And so they can't really be considered part of the same tradition. I'd love to hear your take on that. And Mahdi Askari's question is, would Samy expand on the definition and scope of, he's written it in Persian, Velayat al-Ulama, please. This concept seems similar to Velayat al-Faqih, which is obviously the Shi'i concept that is currently sort of ruling Iran. And Mahdi asks that my understanding was that such a concept was really a Shi'i concept rather, but it looks like within Sunnism there is a comparable sort of notion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sama. And thank you, Mahdi, for your question. So I did not mention anything about something called Wilayatul Ulama, just to be clear. And I don't claim that the ulama even made this kind of proposition themselves. Look, in my current work, there is a general thesis that is obviously and kind of maintained in the field in relation to the secularization of law in Egypt. The famous work by Assad and others, they show this very clearly. However, I would say that intellectual history is insufficient to give us insights into the processes by which that was, again, brought into material reality with people. I would claim in my current work that if we give a much more attention to what I claim is procedure, okay? Procedure is a very mundane, very technical field of research. I think is much more, it is not interesting side of historical research. I think this is actually, must look more carefully into this. For example, Egypt started the rise of regulatory khadivate, that we have, everything has a la'iha, okay? There's always a regulation of some sort. Literally, there's a la'iha for organizing where donkeys goes in Egypt. There's a la'iha for the ma'zoon. There's a la'iha for the mosques. So there's everywhere there's a la'iha, but also there's a la'iha for courts. There's a la'iha for how, so many things going on in this regard. I think we need to look into what details of this procedural law that made some of these things possible. For example, in Islamic courts, we learn in the 1900s, less than 20% of Islamic courts' decision was actually applied. I was shocked by that. I wasn't aware. So how that was possible? I learned that in 1897, the Khedive passed a quote-unquote administrative decision saying that those who will enforce Islamic courts' decisions are quote-unquote jihat al-idara, literally means administrative employees. It's no longer a kind of law enforcement, if you think about it. This is completely unlike how this national courts used to operate. My point of departure here is saying there's a certain type of procedural rules that made possible why people started going to these national secular courts and not Islamic courts, not because these things are more interesting or new and modern, but for procedural and much more material reasons that made it extremely difficult for you to get your positions and your judgment to be enforced. Getting anything out of this is more expensive, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a much more interesting side to look into this details of that process of secularization and how this kind of institutional demarcation functions. To my surprise, if you ask anybody who study American law today, for example, we know everything, about who's American judges, their names, what they do, their position, their politics, their favorite food. If you ask the same question about Muslim judges in Egypt, no one knows anything about the names, where these guys came from. So they are nameless. We reduce them into a position in law. We have nothing about the networking, the training. Again, I think this is completely not something that we should entertain. We need to look into this more carefully in this way. So this ulama class, and people thought on Sheikh al-Azhar, but again, what about Muslim judges? Till today, there's no any histories of Wazarat al-Haqqaniyya, the Ministry of Justice in Egypt. Till today, who's this ministers? Their pictures are very difficult to find. The individual details are completely kind of out there. Somebody have to look into this. I found this to be more important than simply asserting a general abstract theories about how things are to function in Egypt, because without these details, I think we'll lose a lot. To your question about Islamists, look, I'm not really expert in the field. I think you're the expert. My point was just a basic observation that people would say why Islamists are not engaging with Juwaini. So, and my point, why Juwaini and why Mawardi? Okay, doesn't Mawardi inform how the Egyptian state functions today? To my surprise, for example, I'm working on this Egyptian Constitutional Court, which claims that in Egypt, the president is Wali al-Amr. In Egypt, the Constitution of 1923 made clear that the president is no longer Wali al-Amr. But that court affirmed that the president is Wali al-Amr. I wonder where this is coming from. This is not coming from Juwaini for sure. This is
That's where you're wrong.
I'm going to stop there because there'll be other questions. But this is the funny part about this, that is unclear how the modern government functions allow themselves some of these authorities by simply, we take for granted that somehow the Egyptian Supreme Court in Egypt today, in the moment in which we're speaking, somehow consult the Quran and Sunnah. If you meet some of these judges in person, or meet an Iraqi or Syrian judge in person, you will see the immediate difference in training and language, the relationship to Islamic law. And yet, when they affirm something that is Islamic law, we should somehow take that for granted. And this is the reason why Islamic law functions in Egypt. I'm not taking them seriously. I think this is completely something that to be probed further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samy. Faisal, I don't know if you want to sort of take things any further. I understand we need to wrap up in about 5 minutes. We do have a couple of very brief questions, and they seem to be more about the Khedivul state. So I was going to redirect them to Samy. I, as per usual in these wonderful seminars, have a whole list of questions which could take us on for another hour, but I'm not going to sort of torture anyone at this point in time. But just these two questions very briefly. I think they may be the same question from Mohammed Shaheen, who asks, what was the extent of the Ottoman state in Khedive Egypt? The other one basically rephrases this as the extent of the influence of the Ottoman state in Khedive Egypt. So this is more for Samy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the answer to this question was based on what time period that we are discussing. The time period that I'm currently focusing on is colonial Egypt, when the British officially occupied it in 1882. In this context, the British had actual material military power and administration over Egypt under the Ottoman total, of course. So in this framework, the Ottomans had some say on some things and not others. So to have a specific answer to the contours of that power, well, I don't think we can, but we can see some of these glimpses. So the Ottoman, for example, Ottoman Sultan has to issue a farman for the appointment of the Khedive, for example. Even if the Khedive was fired by the British, but usually they need to have an official Ottoman Sultan edict or decree to allow a new position, a new Khedive to come to power. Some of the issues with regard to Egypt seeking loans, issues with regard to international treaties, the Ottomans has always been involved in some of this conversation. In terms of the internal administration of Egypt, that was really completely severed to some extent, to a great extent. However, Islamic courts, ironically, continue to be a symbol of Ottoman political sovereignty in Egypt. Because look, Islamic courts across what I call Islamdom under the Ottomans, if you go and litigate your case in front of a Muslim judge in Jerusalem, or a Muslim judge in Anatolia, a Muslim judge in Syria, a Muslim judge in Egypt, all of the judgments were valid if you just bring the judgment to Egypt and enforce them for you. There's no problem at all. Okay, so the assumption then that system was unified is part of how the Ottoman order used to function. That of course, completely diminished after World War I. So again, so the question can be answered different ways. That will depend on exactly what type of institutions, what type of domains I'd like to investigate, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. I think I'll hand over to Faisal at this point.
Yeah, so shall we give the last word to Neguin and then we can close?
Absolutely.
Well, all I want to say is that it is a very rich discussion, and I'm very glad that that we had it. I think that the question of whether or not Sayyid Qutb engages with Jowaini instead of the Egyptian Constitution of 1923 is not the answer to the question, of course, is not why should he doesn't, but the question is why he doesn't, and to compare him with other Islamist thinkers of the period who in fact did. And that itself will, I think, go a long way in explaining, for instance, from the legal point of view, one of the most interesting things about Islamic courts in the 19th century is that as the state becomes more secular, the jurists, in fact, become more independent. So the secularity or the secular quotient in the political apparatus becomes a lot more fortified as a result of a number of factors in the 19th century. But then the jurists become more independent and they adjudicate and they theorize in completely new ways. There's a wonderful article by Christoph Werner on the legal history of Iran in the 19th century, and which focuses precisely on completely new innovations in Islamic contracts. The place where you would not expect to study as a locus of legal change, but in the study of contracts, which as a very prevalent branch of Islamic law has a long history, you have completely new contracts, new ideas of contracts that emerge in the 19th century as the legal system changes in response to the growth of or the development of a secular state apparatus. So I think that the last word on that debate, Samy, is yet to be said. Well, we have to say tuned in for it. But thank you everyone for it. I very much enjoyed this session.
Thank you so much. Faisal, I've actually pulled up for what the next session is. Would you like me to read it, or do you have?
Yes, please announce it.
Sure. Yeah. So, just very briefly, thank you to everyone for attending this week. It's really been a wonderful and very engaging seminar. And in 2 weeks' time, this is a fortnightly seminar, we'll be having Nasreen Badawi and Murad Idris, both coming in from different parts of the world. Nasreen will be speaking about debating, the theme is violence, and Nasreen will be talking about debating militancy in the modern world, whereas Murad will be talking about theorizing colonialism, capitalism, and violence in an Islamist key. So we'll be back with the Islamists before long. But thank you so much to both of you. Thanks, Faisal. And it really has been an eye-opening hour and a half, and we look forward to having you in Oxford in person again before long. And until next time, have a good evening.